The year was 1850, and the skyline of New York City was a promise written in brick and smoke. The docks groaned under the weight of European cargo. The streets teemed with German and Irish immigrants who arrived with nothing and hoped to leave with something. In a cramped tenement on the west side of Manhattan, a 53-year-old man named Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg sat at a workbench surrounded by the wreckage of his past. He had been orphaned twice. He had survived Napoleon's wars. He had fought at Waterloo. He had built 482 pianos in Germany with his own hands. And now, in America, he was working for $6 a week in someone else's factory, unable to speak English, unknown and invisible. But Heinrich Steinweg knew something that nobody else in New York knew. He knew how to build a piano that would make emperors weep. Within 3 years, he would found a company that concert halls would beg to supply. Within 20 years, he would build a factory village in the marshlands of Queens that would employ hundreds and reshape an entire borough. But the empire he was building would cost him 2 of his sons, ignite a war with organized labor, and end more than a century later in the hands of a hedge fund manager who would see pianos not as instruments of culture, but as real estate assets on a balance sheet. Before we step inside the factory that would become the beating heart of American piano making, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind America's industrial empires, subscribe so you don't miss our next journey. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a kitchen in Germany, where this empire was born in secret. The kitchen was in Seesen, Germany. The year was 1836. Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg stood over a workbench he had built in secret, constructing something that would change his life. He was building a grand piano. He was doing it without permission. In the rigid guild system of 19th century Germany, an independent craftsman like Heinrich wasn't supposed to manufacture complete instruments. He was supposed to repair them. He was supposed to stay in his place. But Heinrich had never stayed in his place. His entire life had been an exercise in survival against impossible odds. He was born on February 22, 1797, in Wolfhagen im Harz, a village in the Duchy of Brunswick. The cottage where he was born had wooden floors, worn smooth by generations of feet. The air smelled of wood smoke and bread. By the age of 8, he was an orphan. The Napoleonic Wars had swept through northern Germany like a scythe through wheat. His parents were dead. His siblings were scattered. He was alone. The village that had been his entire world became a graveyard. Neighbors who had known him since birth looked at him with pity and then looked away. An orphan had no future. An orphan was a burden. An orphan was already half dead. But then something unexpected happened. His father and 3 of his brothers, all thought to have been killed in action, returned. They had survived battles that killed thousands. They had walked through fields of corpses and emerged whole. Heinrich was reclaimed, the family rebuilt. They constructed a shelter of wood and stone in the ruins of Wolfshagen. For 2 years, Heinrich had a family again. He slept on a straw mattress next to his brothers. He ate at a table where his father sat at the head. He belonged to something. And then it was taken from him again. At age 10, the French army retreated through the region, burning homes as they went. Soldiers kicked down doors and put torches to thatched roofs. The Steinweg house was torched. Heinrich watched the flames climb the walls. He watched the roof collapse. Everything inside burned. The straw mattresses, the wooden table, the tools his father had used to build furniture. Heinrich's sister ran away with a soldier and was never seen again. Some said she went to France. Others said she died on the road. At 15, Heinrich was orphaned for the second time. His father and brothers died. The causes were never recorded. Perhaps disease, perhaps starvation, perhaps despair. He was alone again. This time, there would be no rescue. He joined the German army because it was the only institution that would take him. In 1814, he enlisted in the Schwarze Schar, the volunteer corps fighting Napoleon's occupation. He was assigned as a bugler. He learned to play calls that ordered men to advance, to retreat, to hold their ground. He served at the Battle of Waterloo, standing in a field in Belgium, while cannon fire tore the earth apart and musket smoke choked the sky. He was 17 years old. He was commended for his service. And crucially, during his military years, he learned cabinet making and woodworking from other soldiers. Men who had been carpenters before the war taught him how to joint wood, how to plane surfaces flat, how to carve joints that would hold for generations. The skills would save his life. After the war, Heinrich apprenticed as an organ builder in the town of Goslar. He studied the mechanics of sound, the physics of vibration, the art of making wood sing. He learned that different species of wood produced different tones. Spruce was bright, maple was crisp, oak was dark and warm. He learned that the angle of a soundboard determined how vibrations traveled. He learned that air moving through pipes could be shaped into music. By 1825, he had taught himself piano construction. He studied every forte piano he could find, taking measurements, sketching mechanisms, memorizing proportions. That year he married Julianne Thiemer, the daughter of a master glove maker in Season. His wedding gift to her was a forte piano, his first piano built by hand in his workshop. The sound was perfect. The keys responded to the lightest touch. Julianne wept when she played it. Over the next 14 years, Heinrich and Julianne had 10 children. 9 survived. The sons were put to work in their father's shop as soon as they were old enough to hold a tool. There was no childhood for the Steinweg boys. There were apprenticeships. Heinrich was a perfectionist and a taskmaster. He demanded excellence. He demanded innovation. A joint that was merely good enough was not acceptable. A soundboard that was almost perfectly shaped was a failure. Each son learned to build a piano from the ground up, every component, every action, every key. They learned to steam bend wood into curved rims. They learned to string wires at precise tensions. They learned to voice hammers so that each note sang with equal clarity. In 1836, Heinrich built his masterpiece in the kitchen of his house in Season. The _0_, as it would later be called, was a full-size grand piano constructed in secret, away from the prying eyes of the guild inspectors who would have fined him or worse for exceeding his station. The piano had a rosewood case. The soundboard was made of alpine spruce that Heinrich had selected himself from a timber merchant's yard. He had rejected 40 boards before finding one with the perfect grain. The action was his own design, faster and more responsive than any piano available in Germany. It was perfect. In 1839, Heinrich exhibited 3 pianos at the State Trade Exhibition in Braunschweig. Nobles and merchants crowded around his instruments. They ran their hands over the polished wood. They pressed the keys and listened to the tone. He was awarded a gold medal. His reputation spread. By 1850, he had built 482 pianos under the Steinweg name. He had a successful business. He had a family. He had respect. But Germany was becoming unstable. The revolutions of 1848 had shaken the German states. Barricades had been erected in Berlin. Mobs had burned the homes of aristocrats. The King of Prussia had fled his palace. Political unrest was constant. The guild system strangled independent craftsmen like Heinrich. No matter how skilled he became, no matter how many medals he won, he would never be permitted to expand beyond his small workshop. His sons would inherit his station, and nothing more. Heinrich saw no future for his sons in a country that wouldn't let them rise. In 1849, he sent his third son, Charles, to New York to investigate the possibilities. Charles was 23 years old. He spoke some English. He had Heinrich's talent for woodworking and his mother's talent for negotiation. Charles wrote back with a favorable report. America was hungry for pianos. America had no guilds. America rewarded skill, not birthright. A man could build an empire in America if he had the will and the craft. In 1850, Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg made a decision that would define the next century and a half. He sold his workshop for $780. He left his eldest son, C.F. Theodore, in charge of the German business. He boarded a ship with his wife, 5 sons, and 3 daughters. He was 53 years old. He spoke no English. He had no contacts in America, but he knew how to build a piano better than anyone alive. The voyage across the Atlantic took 6 weeks. The family slept in steerage, packed into bunks with 100 other German immigrants. The smell was unbearable. Vomit and sweat and unwashed bodies. Children cried. Adults prayed. The ship pitched in storms. Waves crashed over the deck. But Heinrich stood at the rail and looked west. He was going to a country where orphans could become millionaires. The question was whether America wanted what he was selling. America, it turned out, didn't care about his reputation. In the piano workshops of Lower Manhattan, Heinrich Steinweg was just another German immigrant with calloused hands and broken English. The Steinweg family settled in the 14th Ward, the neighborhood bounded by Houston Street to the north and Canal Street to the south, Broadway and Bowery on the sides. This was where piano manufacturing was concentrated. This was where the German immigrants worked. The streets smelled of sawdust and varnish. Piano factories occupied converted warehouses. You could hear hammers striking strings from half a block away. Heinrich and his sons took jobs at established piano companies to learn American trade practices. Heinrich and his son Henry Jr. earned $6 or $7 a week. Charles and William made $3. They lived in cramped tenements where 6 families shared a single privy in the courtyard. They worked 12-hour days. They saved every penny. But they were also building pianos in secret. They had to be. The wages they earned weren't enough to explain what happened next. On March 5, 1853, Heinrich and his sons founded Steinway Sons. The partnership required an initial investment of $6,000, roughly $180,000 in today's money. There was no way they had saved that much from wages of $3 to $7 per week. Someone was lending them money, or they were making pianos at night, selling them under the table, building capital in the shadows. Heinrich never explained where the money came from. He simply opened the business. Before they founded the company, they changed their name. Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg became Henry Engelhard Steinway. His sons followed. Steinweg became Steinway. Juliane became Julian. Friends had advised them that a German surname would be disadvantageous for doing business in America. The Civil War was a decade away, but anti-German sentiment was already rising. Irish and German immigrants competed for jobs, for housing, for survival. The Anglicization was strategic. The ambition was not. Their first workshop was a small loft at the back of 85 Varick Street in Lower Manhattan. The building no longer exists. The space was barely large enough for 3 workbenches and a rack of tools, but it was theirs. The first piano produced by Steinway Sons was numbered 483, acknowledging the 482 that Heinrich had built in Germany. That first American Steinway sold for $500 to a New York family. The quality was immediately apparent. The tone was richer than any American-made piano. The action was faster. The keys responded to a whisper of pressure. Henry Steinway had brought more than craftsmanship to America. He had brought innovation. In 1855, a Steinway square piano with an overstrung scale won first prize at the New York Industrial Fair. The overstrung scale was a revolutionary design in which the bass strings crossed over the higher strings diagonally, allowing for longer bass strings in a smaller frame. The tone was richer. The resonance was fuller. It was a technical breakthrough disguised as a detail. Competitors didn't understand how Heinrich had achieved the sound. They tore apart Steinway pianos trying to copy the design. In 1857, Steinway Sons was granted its first patent. More would follow, many more. The patents protected innovations in string tension, in soundboard construction, in the cast iron frame that allowed pianos to hold 20 tons of string tension without warping. By 1859, the company had outgrown the Varick Street loft. The family was getting orders faster than they could fill them. Wealthy New Yorkers wanted Steinway pianos in their parlors. Concert halls wanted Steinway pianos on their stages. In 1860, Henry and his sons invested $150,000, approximately $4.2 million today, in a new factory. It was a 5-story building on 4th Avenue, now called Park Avenue, stretching from 52nd to 53rd Street. The factory was equipped with steam-powered elevators that could lift a grand piano from the ground floor to the finishing room on the 5th floor in under a minute. Woodworking machinery included bandsaws, planers, and lathes powered by a central steam engine. A telegraph line connected the factory to suppliers and dealers. Double iron doors separated each floor to contain fires, a crucial feature in a building filled with sawdust and varnish. The level of mechanization was unusual for New York piano makers. Steinway was adopting new technology faster than its competitors, but the core of the work remained handcraft. 350 men worked in the factory, most of them German immigrants. The official language of the company was German. Foremen barked orders in German. Workers cursed in German. The smell of sawdust mixed with the smell of sauerkraut from lunch pails. Production increased from 500 pianos a year to nearly 1,800. The family had divided responsibilities according to talent. Charles handled sales and factory management. He walked the factory floor every morning, inspecting work, resolving disputes, keeping production on schedule. Henry Jr. focused on technical innovations and design. He held 7 patents by the time he was 30. His desk was covered with sketches, calculations, measurements. William, the fourth son, took charge of advertising, finances, and business strategy. He understood that selling pianos required more than craftsmanship. It required spectacle. Henry Sr. gradually withdrew from daily operations as his health declined. He still came to the factory, but he spent most of his time in a small office on the second floor, reviewing books, signing contracts, and watching his sons build the empire he had dreamed of in a kitchen in Germany. The system worked. By the early 1860s, Steinway and Sons had become one of the largest employers in New York City. The pianos won prizes at exhibitions in New York, London, and Paris. By 1862, Steinway pianos had received more than 35 medals. The family was wealthy. The business was booming. Henry Steinway's dream had come true, but success had a cost that was about to come due. March 11th, 1865. Henry Steinway Jr. died in his bed in Manhattan. He was 35 years old. His lungs had been destroyed by tuberculosis. For years, he had suffered from weak lungs, coughing fits that doubled him over, nights where he couldn't breathe lying down. He had traveled to Cuba during the Civil War in hopes the warm climate would help. It didn't. The tropics made him worse. He came home fevered and skeletal. An autopsy revealed large cavities in both lungs, the tissue thoroughly diseased and black. Henry Jr. was the technical genius of the family. He held 7 patents, including the revolutionary 1859 patent for the overstrung scale in grand pianos on a single-piece cast-iron frame. This was the innovation that had made the modern piano possible. Without Henry Jr., the company had no inventor. The sketches stopped. The measurements stopped. The next generation of innovations died with him. William visited his brother the day before he died. He wrote in his diary that he found Henry dreadfully low, feet and hands swollen, barely able to speak after a coughing fit. Henry's wife, Ernestine, sat beside the bed holding his hand. The room smelled of camphor and sickness. William left his brother's bedside with a heavy heart. The next morning, Henry was dead. He left behind a wife, Ernestine, and 3 young daughters who would grow up without a father. The family was devastated, but the devastation had only begun. 3 weeks later, Charles Steinway died. He had traveled to Germany to visit his older brother Theodore and fell ill with typhoid fever. The fever came suddenly. One day he was healthy. The next day he was burning up, delirious, calling for his wife. On March 31st, 1865, Charles died in Braunschweig. He was 36 years old. Charles had been the operational heart of the company, the one who managed the factory floor and handled sales. He knew every worker by name. He knew which dealers could be trusted and which ones tried to negotiate impossible terms. He left behind a wife, Sophie, and 4 sons. Within 3 weeks, Steinway and Sons had lost its inventor and its manager. The 2 brothers who had built the machines and run the daily operations were gone. William Steinway was 30 years old. He was suddenly alone at the helm of a massive manufacturing operation that employed 350 men and produced 1,800 pianos a year. His father, Henry Sr., was 68 and in declining health. He couldn't help. The company was on the verge of collapse. The family sent an urgent letter to C.F. Theodore Steinweg in Germany, begging him to come to New York. Theodore didn't want to leave. He had a successful business in Braunschweig building pianos under the Steinweg name. He had a comfortable home. He had a life that didn't require him to start over in a foreign country, but his family was bleeding, and he was the only one who could stop it. Theodore sold his share of the German piano factory to his partners, Wilhelm Grotrian and two others. The German company would continue as Grotrian Steinweg, still in operation today. Theodore arrived in New York in the summer of 1865. He was 40 years old. He anglicized his name to C.F. Theodore Steinway and took over the technical operations of the company. For the next 24 years, Theodore would be the inventive genius behind Steinway's rise. He would earn 45 patents, more than any other member of the family. His 1875 patent for the modern concert grand piano design would define the instrument for the next century and a half. The proportions, the string tension, the soundboard curve, all of it came from Theodore's calculations. William handled the business side. Theodore handled the pianos. Together they rebuilt what Charles and Henry Jr. had left behind. But they did it in a city that was becoming hostile. Henry Sr. died on February 7, 1871. Less than a year after witnessing the deaths of two of his sons. He was 73 years old. He had lived to see his dream realized and then shattered. He had built an empire and watched it teeter on the edge of ruin. The company survived, but only because Theodore had come. According to a note from Henry Z. Steinway, the great-grandson, quote, "2, the crisis had passed. The company was stable again. But a new threat was emerging, one that wouldn't be solved by patents or craftsmanship. The workers were organizing, and William Steinway was about to go to war. The night the mob came for the factory, William Steinway and two of his brothers stood at the gates with cash in their hands. It was 1863. The Civil War draft riots had turned Manhattan into a war zone. Gangs of workers, furious at being conscripted while rich men bought their way out of service for $300, were burning buildings across the city. The colored orphan asylum was destroyed. Businesses were looted. Black men were lynched from street lamps. The Steinway factory, with its expensive machinery and German immigrant workforce, was a target. The mob demanded tribute. Pay us, or we burn it down. William paid. Several $100s in bills and coins. The factory was spared, but the incident left a mark. William understood that the workers weren't loyal. They were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. After the war, the piano industry boomed. Middle-class families wanted pianos in their parlors. Churches wanted pianos for services. Schools wanted pianos for instruction. Demand was high. Wages were rising, but so was labor organizing. Piano workers across New York were forming unions. They were demanding better pay, shorter hours, and the right to challenge management decisions. In the 1870s, the unions grew bold. They presented a list of demands to the Pianoforte Manufacturers Society of New York, the employers' organization that had been formed to counter the unions. The workers wanted a 25% pay raise. They wanted the right to review all firings. They wanted 100% union membership in every shop. They wanted guaranteed full-year employment, no layoffs during slow seasons. They wanted weekly inspection of the factory ledgers to verify that management wasn't cheating them on piece rates. The demands were radical. The manufacturers saw them as extortion. The manufacturers, including Steinway, initially resisted, but the unions threatened an industry-wide strike that would shut down every piano factory in New York. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The workers would get an immediate 15% raise with a promise of another 10% in the future. The manufacturers agreed. Contracts were signed. Workers celebrated in beer gardens. But then, instead of absorbing the cost, Steinway and the other companies simply raised their prices. The buyers didn't notice. Wealthy families who wanted a Steinway piano paid whatever Steinway asked. There was no drop in sales. The manufacturers kept their margins, and the promised second raise, it was delayed, then delayed again. The workers seethed. They had been tricked. William Steinway documented the conflict in his diary. He wrote with barely concealed contempt for the unions. He called them, quote, 3. He wrote that they were, quote, 4. He saw the labor movement not as a legitimate grievance, but as a foreign infection, a European radicalism that had no place in America. He believed that workers who were grateful for their jobs should be obedient. When they weren't, he saw it as betrayal. He saw it as theft. The workers were stealing his profits by demanding wages that ate into his margins. But William knew that he couldn't fight the unions in Manhattan. The city was too dense, too connected, too full of radical organizers who moved from factory to factory, spreading the gospel of labor solidarity. The workers lived in tenements where they talked to each other, shared grievances, and planned actions. They drank together in beer gardens. They attended the same churches. The unions thrived in proximity. If William wanted to control his workers, he needed to separate them from the agitators. He needed to move them somewhere isolated, somewhere he could control not just their work, but their entire lives. In 1870, William Steinway took a ferry across the East River to Queens. He was looking for land, not just land for a factory, but land for a kingdom. The land was worthless. That was the point. 400 acres of salt meadow, farmland, and swamp stretched along the shore of Bowery Bay in northwestern Queens. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. The ground was soggy and treacherous. There were no roads. There were no houses. The nearest settlement was a scattering of German farmers who grew vegetables for the Manhattan markets. The land was cheap. It was isolated, and it was across the river from the unions. William Steinway stood in the mud in his great rubber boots and saw something no one else saw. He saw control. Between 1870 and 1871, William purchased more than 400 acres of waterfront property. Some of it he bought directly from farmers who were eager to sell land that produced nothing but marsh grass. Some he bought at auction when estates were liquidated. One of the properties he acquired was a mansion that had belonged to Benjamin Pike, Jr., a Manhattan-based scientific instrument maker who had fallen into financial trouble. William paid $125,500 for the Pike estate. The mansion was a three-story Italianate villa with 17 rooms, tall windows, and a cupola on the roof. It had been built in 1858. The grounds included gardens, a carriage house, and views of the East River. The mansion would become the Steinway family's summer home, a place where William could escape the heat of Manhattan and entertain business associates. It still stands today, a New York City landmark and a National Register site. But the mansion was only the beginning. William had a much larger plan. In 1873, he built the factory. It wasn't just a building, it was an entire industrial complex. The factory occupied 11 acres and included a sawmill for cutting lumber and a foundry for casting the iron frames that formed the structural heart of every Steinway piano. This meant Steinway Sons could control the entire production process from raw material to finished instrument. The company sawed its own wood, it cast its own metal, it assembled its own pianos. Vertical integration gave William independence from suppliers, who could raise prices or delay shipments. It also gave him leverage over competitors who still relied on outside contractors. The factory building itself was 3 stories tall, made of brick with large windows to let in natural light. The timber frame construction used massive beams that could support the weight of stacks of lumber and racks of cast iron frames. But the factory was only part of the vision. William knew that building a factory in the middle of nowhere meant he had to build everything else too. Workers wouldn't commute from Manhattan. There was no transportation. The ferry crossing took too long. The roads were unpaved and impassable in rain. So William built the transportation. He founded the Steinway Railway Company and laid trolley tracks connecting the factory to the ferry landings at the edge of the East River. He built a ferry service that ran every hour during the workday. The workers could ride the Steinway trolley to the Steinway ferry to get to the Steinway factory. Every step was controlled. Every dollar spent on transportation went back to William. Then he built the houses. William constructed rows of brick homes near the factory and offered them for rent or purchase to his workers. The terms were generous: low rent, low interest mortgages. The houses were well built, with running water and modern amenities. They had front porches and small yards. They were nicer than the tenements in Manhattan by orders of magnitude. But they came with a condition. If you went on strike, you could be evicted. If you challenged management, you could be foreclosed upon. William knew that a worker who owed him rent money, or worse, a mortgage, would think twice before walking out. The houses weren't charity, they were chains. Next came the infrastructure. William built a post office and named himself postmaster. He built the Steinway Library, starting it with books from his own collection, volumes of philosophy and history, and technical manuals. Today it's a branch of the Queens Library. He built a public school that included one of the first free kindergartens in the United States, a progressive idea imported from Germany. He built the Protestant Union Church and personally selected the minister. He organized a volunteer fire department and provided the equipment. He laid out streets and named them after his workers, honoring the men who had been loyal to the company for decades. Later, the main thoroughfare would be renamed Steinway Street. It's still called that today. For entertainment, William created Bowery Bay Beach. It opened in 1886 and featured an amusement park, a swimming pavilion, a Ferris wheel, and a German beer garden that could seat 500 people. Workers could ride the trolley to the beach on their days off and drink Steinway-approved beer while a brass band played waltzes. The village had everything: a factory, homes, schools, churches, parks, transportation, entertainment. By the mid-1870s, 400 workers were employed in Queens. The village was roughly bounded by Bowery Bay to the north, Ditmars Boulevard to the south, and 31st Street to Hazen Street from west to east. It was called Steinway Village. The residents called it a model community. Newspapers wrote glowing articles about William's benevolence. William called it a solution to the labor problem. But the labor problem didn't stay in Manhattan. In February 1880, the varnishers in the Steinway factory went on strike. They wanted higher wages. The work was dangerous. The varnish contained chemicals that made men sick. The fumes caused headaches, nausea, tremors. Workers who spent years in the varnish room often died young. The varnishers demanded hazard pay. Within days, workers in both the Manhattan and Queens factories walked out in solidarity. William's dream of escaping the unions by moving to Queens had failed. The socialists didn't need to travel far to find angry workers. The workers had brought the anger with them. William Steinway's model village became a picket line. The war had followed him across the river. The 1880 strike ended the way most strikes ended in the Gilded Age. The workers got a raise, management got revenge. And Steinway Sons kept getting richer. William responded to the strike by leading an industry-wide lockout of piano workers in New York City. If the unions wanted to fight, he would starve them into submission. The lockout lasted weeks. Families went hungry. Children cried for food. The unions blinked first. Work resumed. Wages went up slightly. But William didn't forget. Throughout the 1880s, Steinway hired detectives from the Pinkerton agency to spy on workers. They infiltrated union meetings. They reported which workers were agitators. The company paid police officers to side with management during disputes and protect company property from vandalism. Strike leaders were evicted from company housing. Workers who owed mortgages to Steinway found their loans called in if they challenged the bosses. Families lost their homes. The control was total, but none of it mattered in the long run, because Steinway Sons was becoming a monopoly, and William Steinway was about to take the company global. In 1880, William and Theodore made a strategic decision. They would open a second factory in Hamburg, Germany. There were several reasons. First, European tariffs on American pianos were punishing. France charged 20%, Britain charged 15%. Manufacturing in Europe would avoid the duties and make Steinway pianos competitive with European brands. Second, labor costs in Germany were lower than in the United States. German piano workers earned less and complained less. The unions hadn't organized German factories the way they had organized American ones. Third, Theodore missed Germany. He had never fully adjusted to American life. He disliked New York. He disliked American workers and their demands for rights. He was a hard-nosed employer who believed workers should be grateful for employment and silent about conditions. Hamburg would be his domain. Theodore moved to Germany to run the Hamburg factory. He would oversee production there for the rest of his life, traveling occasionally to New York but spending most of his time in Europe, where he was treated like an industrial prince. The Hamburg factory used slightly different techniques than the New York operation. The varnish was applied differently. with more coats and longer drying times, making Hamburg Steinways more resistant to climate extremes. European buyers preferred the Hamburg sound, which was slightly darker and more mellow than the New York sound, but the core design remained the same. The patents were shared. The two factories would supply different markets. New York would serve the Americas. Hamburg would serve Europe and Asia. The strategy worked. By the late 1880s, Steinway was the dominant piano manufacturer in both hemispheres. While Theodore handled manufacturing, William focused on marketing. And William Steinway was a marketing genius. In 1866, a decade before the Hamburg factory opened, William had done something audacious. He built Steinway Hall on East 14th Street in Manhattan. It wasn't just a showroom. It was a concert hall with 2,000 seats and acoustics that rivaled any venue in the world. The ceiling was 40 feet high. The walls were covered in velvet. The stage could accommodate a full orchestra. Steinway Hall became the premier concert venue in New York City. The New York Philharmonic made it their home for more than 25 years. Operas were performed there. Lectures were held there. Every pianist who wanted to be taken seriously played at Steinway Hall, and every pianist who played there played on a Steinway piano. The audience heard Steinway. The critics reviewed Steinway. The association between excellence and Steinway became automatic. This was the birth of the Steinway Artist program. William offered exclusive performance contracts to the world's greatest pianists. If they agreed to play only on Steinway pianos, the company would provide them with instruments for concerts, recordings, and tours. The pianos would be maintained at company expense. The artists would receive a stipend. The artists got free pianos and money. Steinway got a monopoly on concert halls. By the late 19th century, it was nearly impossible to hear a major pianist perform on anything other than a Steinway. Anton Rubinstein signed. Raphael Josefi signed. Vladimir de Pachman signed. The strategy worked so well that it continues today. More than 90% of concert pianists still choose Steinway. The accolades piled up. In 1883, Franz Liszt, one of the greatest pianists and composers in history, wrote a letter to Steinway praising the grand piano as a glorious masterpiece in power, sonority, singing quality, and perfect harmonic effects. He wrote that the piano afforded delight even to my old piano-weary fingers. Liszt was 72 years old. He had played every piano in Europe. His endorsement was pure gold for marketing. William had the letter framed and hung in Steinway Hall. He printed it in advertisements. He sent copies to dealers. In 1890, Queen Victoria of England granted Steinway Sons its first royal warrant, the official designation that Steinway was a supplier to the royal household. Pianos were shipped to Buckingham Palace. Pianos were shipped to royal palaces across Europe. Emperors owned Steinways. Presidents owned Steinways. The name Steinway had become synonymous with quality itself. Owning a Steinway wasn't just about music, it was about status. Theodore's patents kept the company ahead of competitors. He would eventually hold 45 patents, more than any other member of the Steinway family. His 1875 patent for the modern concert grand piano design became the industry standard. The patent covered the exact proportions of the soundboard, the specific tension of the strings, the curvature of the case. Almost half of the company's total 139 patents were developed by the first and second generations of the Steinway family. Competitors tried to copy the innovations, but they couldn't match the craftsmanship. Steinway pianos were simply better. The tone was richer. The action was more responsive. The durability was unmatched. A Steinway could be played 8 hours a day for 30 years and still sound perfect. By the 1890s, Steinway Sons was producing nearly 4,000 pianos a year. The factories in New York and Hamburg employed thousands. The company had showrooms in New York, London, and other major cities. Concert halls competed to host Steinway artists. The family was fabulously wealthy. William had invested the profits in real estate, transportation companies, and the other ventures. He owned the trolley lines in western Queens. He had helped develop the subway system that would eventually connect Manhattan to Queens. He owned ferries, amusement parks, and vast tracts of undeveloped land that would someday be worth millions. But William was exhausted. The work of building an empire had consumed him. His first marriage had ended in scandal in 1876 when he discovered that his son Alfred wasn't his biological child. His wife Regina had had an affair with a family friend. The divorce was devastating. William felt humiliated. He felt betrayed. William remarried in 1880 to Elizabeth Ramft, the daughter of a successful merchant, and they had 3 more children. But the strain of managing the company, fighting the unions, and running his various business ventures was taking a toll. He slept poorly. He had headaches. His diary entries, which had once been detailed and enthusiastic, became shorter and more perfunctory. He wrote less about pianos and more about his fatigue. On November 30th, 1896, William Steinway died at the age of 61. The cause was likely a combination of stress, overwork, and the chronic health problems he had documented in his diary for years. His heart simply gave out. When William died, the company was in trouble. Sales were declining. The business was nearly insolvent. Steinway Sons was selling fewer than 2,000 pianos a year and drowning in debt. The competition had intensified. American manufacturers like Chickering, Mason, and Hamlin and Baldwin were all fighting for market share. The golden age was over, and the question was whether the next generation could save what Henry and William had built. The answer was Charles. Charles H. Steinway, the son of the Charles who had died of typhoid in 1865, took over the company in 1896. He was in his late 30s and had been trained by William in every aspect of the business. He inherited a disaster. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The creditors were circling. Charles nearly sold Steinway Sons to a group of British investors who saw the brand as valuable even if the business was failing. But at the last moment, he decided to fight for survival instead. His strategy was simple and brutal. He slashed prices on the top-tier pianos to undercut competitors. He introduced lower-priced models to capture the middle-class market. The Model M Baby Grand, smaller and more affordable, became a bestseller. The quality was still high, but the brand was no longer exclusively for the wealthy. It worked. By 1906, sales had nearly doubled. Steinway was producing 3,700 pianos a year again. The company was profitable. 1909 was the peak year for the American piano industry. Nationwide, manufacturers sold 365,500 pianos. There were piano factories in Boston, New York, Chicago, Cincinnati, and Los Angeles. There were piano showrooms in every major city. Steinway's share was 3,700, roughly 1% of the market. So it wasn't a large market share, but it was the premium market. Steinway pianos cost more than competitors' instruments, and buyers paid the premium willingly because they knew they were buying the best. The company was profitable again. Charles had saved it. But in 1919, Charles died. His brother, Frederick T. Steinway, took over. Frederick had spent 30 years running the manufacturing side of the business. He understood production better than anyone. He knew which suppliers delivered quality wood. He knew which workers could be trusted with the most delicate tasks. And crucially, during his tenure as president, Frederick built up a multi-million-dollar surplus account. This wasn't for expansion. It was insurance. Frederick had seen businesses fail during economic downturns. He wanted Steinway to survive the next one. He had no idea how severe that downturn would be. In 1927, Frederick died of a stroke at his desk. William's son, Theodore E. Steinway, became president. His tenure would be the unhappiest in the company's history. 1920, radio broadcasts began in America. On November 2, 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh became the first commercial radio station. For the first time, families could listen to music in their homes without anyone playing an instrument. You didn't need sheet music. You didn't need lessons. You didn't need talent. The piano, which had been the center of American family life for generations, was suddenly optional. You didn't need to know how to play. You didn't need to gather around the keyboard on Sunday evenings while mother played hymns and everyone sang. You just turned on the radio. Piano sales began to fall. Steinway was still selling well through the 1920s. In 1926, the company had its best year ever. selling 6,294 grand pianos. But the decline had already started in the broader market. Cheaper piano manufacturers were closing. Families who might have bought a piano were buying radios instead. The culture was shifting. Entertainment was becoming passive rather than active. Then came the crash. October 1929. The stock market collapsed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Banks failed. Businesses closed. The Great Depression began. For Steinway & Sons, the Depression was an extinction-level event. In 1929, the company had posted a net profit of $580,000. In 1930, sales plummeted to 2,379 pianos, and the company lost $265,000. Warehouses filled with unsold instruments. Nobody was buying pianos. People were trying to afford food. Families who owned pianos were selling them for a fraction of their value just to pay rent. The Steinway factories in New York and Hamburg shut down for 20 months in the early 1930s. There was no work. The assembly lines stopped. The workers were sent home without pay. Theodore E. Steinway, the president, cut salaries across the board. Executives, most of them family members, took 66% pay cuts. But the cuts weren't enough. The company was bleeding money every month. The only thing that kept Steinway alive was the surplus account that Frederick had built in the 1920s. The reserves lasted just long enough for the economy to stabilize. Two-thirds of the piano companies in America went bankrupt during the Depression. They couldn't survive the collapse in demand. Chickering nearly closed. Mason and Hamlin went bankrupt. Smaller manufacturers disappeared entirely. Steinway survived, but barely. In 1936, the company introduced its first baby grand piano, a smaller, more affordable model designed for middle-class homes that had less space and less money. In 1938, Steinway resumed manufacturing upright pianos, which had been discontinued years earlier because they were considered inferior. The company was desperate for any sale it could get. The pianos were still beautifully made. The craftsmanship hadn't declined, but the market had evaporated. Then came the war. In 1941, the United States entered World War II. Steinway pivoted to war production, but not entirely. The company made wooden parts for military gliders. They made equipment crates, but they also made a decision that seemed absurd at the time, but became legendary. Between 1941 and 1953, Steinway & Sons built 3,000 upright pianos called _7. They were specially designed to be lightweight and durable. They could survive being dropped from planes. The military parachuted them into bases and camps around the world. Soldiers gathered around the Steinways to sing. They played jazz. They played hymns. They played folk songs from home. The pianos became symbols of home, of culture, of the life they were fighting to preserve. The victory verticals kept Steinway's name alive during the war years when luxury goods were unthinkable. But when the soldiers came home, they didn't buy pianos. They bought televisions. They bought cars. They bought houses in the suburbs, houses with living rooms too small for a grand piano, and garages big enough for 2 cars. The generation that had gathered around the family piano on Sunday nights was dying. Their children wanted something modern, something that didn't require lessons, something that fit the new American lifestyle. Television replaced radio. And television replaced the piano even more decisively than radio had. By the 1950s, the piano was no longer central to American life. It was a relic. It was furniture that reminded people of their grandparents. The industry never recovered. In 1956, Theodore E. Steinway stepped down as president. He had presided over the worst era in the company's history. It wasn't his fault. The culture had changed beneath him. Technology had changed. Entertainment had changed. The last member of the founding family to run Steinway & Sons was Henry Z. Steinway, the great-grandson of Heinrich. Henry Z. had started at the company in 1937 after graduating from Harvard. He became president in 1956. He would be the last Steinway to hold the title. For 16 years, Henry Z. Steinway fought to keep the company in the family. But the business was struggling. Piano sales nationwide continued to decline. The strikes continued. Workers demanded higher wages. Management refused. Picket lines went up. Production stopped. In 1972, after a lengthy and bitter strike that lasted months, Henry Zieg made the decision that ended the dynasty. He sold Steinway Sons to CBS, Incorporated. The broadcaster paid an undisclosed sum and took the company private. Henry Z remained involved with the company, signing custom pianos and representing the family at public events, but he was no longer in control. He was a figurehead. The Steinway family empire, which had lasted 119 years from 1853 to 1972, was over. CBS bought Steinway the way a museum buys a painting, not because they wanted to improve it, but because owning it conferred prestige. At the time of the acquisition, CBS owned Fender guitars, Rogers drums, Rhodes pianos, and the New York Yankees. Steinway was just another asset in a portfolio of entertainment brands. The problem was that CBS didn't understand pianos. The company was run by executives who cared about quarterly earnings, not about the century-and-a-half tradition of handcrafted instruments. Bureaucracy increased. Forms had to be filled out in triplicate. Management turnover was high. Reorganizations were constant. Different executives imposed different strategies. Steinway Sons, which had once been the beating heart of a family business, became a tiny fraction of a massive corporation. The workers in Queens kept making pianos the same way they always had, but the soul of the company was gone. In 1985, CBS sold Steinway to a group of private investors led by John and Robert Birmingham. The company changed hands again. The new owners promised to respect the tradition. They promised to invest in the factory. They didn't. In 1996, Steinway was sold again, this time to the Selmer Company, a musical instrument conglomerate based in Los Angeles. Steinway merged with Selmer to form Steinway Musical Instruments, Incorporated. The new parent company was publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol LVB for Ludwig van Beethoven. For the first time in its history, Steinway was owned by shareholders, not by a family or even a private company. Quarterly earnings reports mattered more than generational legacy. The late 20th century was brutal for piano manufacturers. Asian companies, particularly Yamaha and Kawai, had entered the market in the 1960s and 70s. They produced high-quality pianos at lower prices using efficient manufacturing techniques and cheap labor. A Yamaha grand piano cost half what a Steinway cost and sounded nearly as good to untrained ears. European competitors like Petroff, Schimmel, and Busendorfer also captured market share. Steinway's dominance eroded. The company still held more than 80% of the high-end concert grand piano market, but the overall piano market was shrinking. Fewer Americans were buying pianos at all. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. The economy collapsed. Luxury goods sales plummeted. Steinway grand piano sales fell by half. Between August 2008 and November 2009, the company laid off 30% of its union employees in the Queens factory. Skilled craftsmen who had worked at Steinway for decades were given pink slips and escorted out. Sales in the United States dropped 21% in 2009. The company was in crisis again. In June 2013, a private equity firm called Kohlberg & Company offered to buy Steinway Musical Instruments for $438 million. $35 per share. The board considered the offer. Shareholders debated whether to accept. But 2 months later, a hedge fund called Paulson & Company, run by billionaire John Paulson, made a higher bid. Paulson had made his fortune betting against subprime mortgages during the housing crisis. He was worth billions. He offered $512 million, $40 per share. The board recommended that shareholders accept. On September 19, 2013, Paulson & Company completed the acquisition. Steinway was taken private again. The stock was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. John Paulson issued a statement saying that his goal was Steinway, and to the statement sounded noble. The reality was different. 6 years later, in 2019, Paulson sold nearly half of the factory's land. A group of investors that included actor Robert De Niro paid $73 million for 5 acres of the Steinway property in Queens. They planned to build a film studio for television and streaming productions. Netflix would eventually lease space there. The factory would continue operating on the remaining land, but the message was clear. Paulson wasn't in the piano business. He was in the real estate business. The land that William Steinway had bought for pennies in 1870 was now worth more than the company that sat on top of it. The factory is still there. 1 Steinway Place, Astoria, Queens. The building is more than 150 years old. Parts of the original structure from 1873 remain, though additions and renovations have obscured the original brickwork. Inside, workers are still bending wood by hand. They heat long strips of maple in steam boxes until the wood becomes pliable. Then they clamp the strips into massive metal molds shaped like the curved rim of a grand piano. They are still stringing wires individually, adjusting tension with tuning pins, listening for the perfect pitch. They are still voicing hammers by ear, pricking the felt with needles to soften the tone or compressing it to brighten the sound. Each Steinway piano is made of more than 12,000 individual parts. 80% of the work is done by hand. It takes 9 to 12 months to build a single piano, not counting the year required to cure the wood before it even enters the factory. Steinway produces approximately 2,500 pianos per year, split between the New York and Hamburg factories. The craftsmanship hasn't changed. A Steinway built in 2025 is made the same way a Steinway was made in 1875, but everything around the factory has changed. For decades, Steinway offered public tours of the Queens facility. The tours were famous. Visitors could watch craftsmen bend the wooden rims, install the soundboards, string the pianos, and tune the instruments. The tours were rated by Forbes as one of the top 3 factory tours in the country, alongside Boeing and Ben & Jerry's. But the public tours ended. The company stopped offering them and never resumed. Now only virtual tours are available online. Pre-recorded videos that show the factory floor but lack the smell of sawdust and varnish, the heat from the steam boxes, the sound of hammers striking strings. VIP tours can still be arranged for educational institutions and major donors, but the general public is locked out. The factory has become a fortress. Outside the factory, the piano industry is collapsing. Steinway dealers across the country have been closing for years. The Chicago Steinway dealer shut down. Phoenix closed. Denver closed. Birmingham, Alabama, which had a Steinway dealer for over 100 years, closed. Even the Beverly Hills showroom closed, a symbolic death in a city built on wealth and status. Atlanta doesn't have a Yamaha dealer anymore. The infrastructure that supported piano sales for a century is disintegrating. Showrooms are expensive to maintain, technicians are expensive to employ, and nobody is walking in to buy a piano. The used piano market tells the story even more clearly. Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace are flooded with ads offering free pianos. Free upright U-Haul. Free Baldwin console must pick up today. Families can't afford to move them or store them. A piano weighs 400 to 800 pounds. Moving it costs hundreds of dollars. Piano technicians get calls from people who inherited a piano and discovered it hasn't been tuned in 30 years and would cost more to repair than it's worth. Most uprights, especially cheap ones manufactured in the 1960s and 70s, have a usable lifespan of 25 to 30 years. After that, the soundboard cracks, the strings corrode, the hammers wear out, and the action becomes sluggish. Even a well-maintained Steinway needs major work after 80 or 90 years. A full restoration can cost $30,000 or more. But the perception is that pianos last forever. So people hold on to instruments that are essentially garbage and try to give them away. Nobody wants them. The flood of free pianos creates the impression that the industry is dying, and the impression is correct. In 2019, a group of piano buyers sued Steinway Sons in federal court. They claimed the company had marketed its pianos as investments, showing graphs and literature suggesting that Steinway pianos appreciate in value over time like real estate or fine art. The buyers alleged that in reality, most new Steinways depreciate as much as 50% the moment they leave the showroom. Just like cars, a $70,000 Steinway bought new might be worth $35,000 used. The lawsuit highlighted a fundamental problem. Steinways are expensive. A new concert grand can cost more than $150,000. A baby grand can cost $50,000. And unlike a house or a stock, a piano doesn't typically increase in value. It's a depreciating asset, like a car. The buyers felt deceived. They had been sold an investment that turned out to be furniture. The lawsuit was a public relations disaster for a company that had spent 170 years building a reputation for honesty and quality. The workers in Queens are still making pianos the way Heinrich Steinway made them in 1853. They are still bending the wood by hand. They are still stringing each wire individually. They are still voicing the hammers by ear. The craft hasn't changed, but everything around it has. The factory that once employed thousands now employs hundreds. The company town that William built is now just a neighborhood in Astoria with a name that most people don't recognize. Steinway Street still runs through the area, but few know why. The mansion where the Steinway family spent their summers is a New York City landmark and a National Register site, but almost no one visits. Tours are by appointment only. Some of the original worker housing from the 1870s still stands on 20th Avenue and 41st Street. Brick row houses with stoops and small yards, but the residents today have no connection to the piano industry. They work in Manhattan. They work in tech. They work in finance. They don't even know a piano factory is nearby. And the pianos themselves, the instruments that emperors and presidents once fought to own, are being given away for free on the internet because families can't afford to move them or tune them or keep them. The Steinway factory in Queens is still making the finest pianos in the world. But the world has stopped caring. This is the story of an immigrant who built something perfect in an imperfect world. Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg was orphaned twice before he turned 16. He survived wars that killed his family. He learned a craft that saved his life. He came to America with nothing and built an empire that defined excellence for more than a century and a half. But the empire cost him 2 of his sons. It cost him his health. And it cost his descendants their legacy when the family finally sold to a corporation that saw pianos as assets on a balance sheet. William Steinway built a company town in the marshlands of Queens. He called it a model village. The workers called it something else. William provided housing, schools, churches, and entertainment. But he also provided control. If you went on strike, you lost your home. If you challenged management, you lost your credit. The company town was paternalism disguised as benevolence. And it was perfectly legal. William fought the unions for decades. He hired spies, he paid police, he evicted families, and none of it worked. The labor war never ended. It simply became part of the cost of doing business. The irony is that Steinway and Sons didn't fail because of labor strife or foreign competition or corporate mismanagement. It failed because the culture changed. Americans stopped gathering around the piano on Sunday evenings. Radio replaced live music. Television replaced radio. Digital entertainment replaced television. The piano, which had been the center of family life, became furniture. And furniture doesn't need to be a Steinway. Today, more than 90% of concert pianists still choose Steinway. Nearly 200 universities worldwide are all Steinway schools, institutions that have committed to using only Steinway pianos for instruction and performance. The 300,000th Steinway piano, built in 1938, still sits in the East Room of the White House. When a virtuoso sits down to perform at Carnegie Hall, the odds are overwhelming that the instrument under their hands is a Steinway. The quality endures. The reputation survives. But for ordinary Americans, the piano has become irrelevant. In 1978, 1 in every 316 American homes had a piano. Today, fewer than 1 in 3,000 homes has one. The factory in Queens is still operational. The workers are still there. Steinway Street still bears the family's name. The mansion still stands. But the culture that made pianos essential is gone. Heinrich Steinway wanted to build the best piano possible. He succeeded. Every Steinway that leaves the Queens factory today is a masterpiece of craft, a triumph of handwork over machine work, a testament to the idea that some things should not be compromised. But he also built an empire on the backs of German and Irish immigrants who lived in fear of eviction. He built a monopoly that crushed competitors. He built a company town that controlled every aspect of workers' lives. And in the end, none of it mattered. Because the culture that valued a piano in every parlor, that gathered on Sunday evenings to sing together, that believed music was something you made rather than something you consumed, that culture died. The Steinway factory didn't fail because it stopped making great pianos. It failed because America stopped wanting them.